Good morning. My name is Chanel Hayson. I am the Director of Outreach and Community Relations for the Elakha Alliance, and I want to welcome you today to our 2025 Elakha Alliance Virtual Science Symposium held annually each fall. I have a quick little couple slides before we get started today. So the Elakha Alliance is a nonprofit organization based here in Oregon, founded by tribal members, leaders, conservationists, and nonprofit advocates united with a powerful vision. Our mission is to make Oregon's marine and coastal ecosystems and communities more robust and resilient by restoring a healthy population of sea otters back to the Oregon coast. How you can help really quickly, if you would like, if you haven't already signed up for our RAFT newsletter, we also do presentations to organizations and classrooms. And also we're a nonprofit, so donations are very welcomed. And thank you for donating to attend today as well. So we selected Restoring Balance, Sea Otter Conservation Lessons and Updates as this year's symposium theme to coincide with the release of Sea Otter Conservation II Nearshore Ecosystem Restoration book, which you'll hear a lot about today because each presenter today is a primary or supporting author of all of the chapters. So we're very lucky and excited to have them here to talk about the latest highlights of research and conservation insights on their ecosystem restoration and amazingness as a keystone species. So just quickly, let's go over some etiquette for today's symposium. The attendees' webcams and microphones will be off during the entirety of the symposium. We will stick to the schedule, so 1 hour for each presenter. And if we end early, we'll still have the Zoom on, so you can jump on and off anytime you'd like. Please use the Q&A feature if you have any questions. I will facilitate those after each presentation. And please be respectful. If you would like to drop in the chat box where you're tuning in today, that's always fun to see who we have from around the world. And thank you so much for joining us. So we do have a little update due to the federal government shutdown. Heather Coletti from the National Park Service will be unable to present today. She was scheduled for 1 o'clock, so we bumped everybody up after that. So our presentations will be from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. today. And once again, a huge thank you to our presenters for taking time out of their busy schedules to join us for this symposium. And now I'm going to pass it off to Jim Bodkin, scientist emeritus with the U.S. Geological Society and has close to 50 years of experience with sea otters and marine ecosystems. He'll be presenting today on the first chapter of the book, plus several others, as you get some bonus surprises. And I will pass it off to Jim now. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Chanel.
You're welcome.
Does this look appropriate?
Yes. Do you want to turn your camera on or do you want to stay off?
Oh, I can turn it on. No, I can. I guess let's see. Start video.
There you go.
Okay.
All right.
So
you're off.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, Chanel. Thanks to the Elakha Alliance for inviting Sea Otter Conservation Volume 2 into your symposium today. I'm going to begin by mentioning Sea Otter Conservation, the original, published in 2015. And this book reported on the process and progress of the recovery of sea otters from the maritime fur trade, highlighting what was known of their natural history, human relations, and what might affect their continued conservation. But it was very much a book that was focused on sea otter biology and natural history. Sorry, I have to move some things around here. But so in a couple of years ago, academic press approached Sean and myself about a second volume. And our initial reaction was, well, we really didn't want to produce another volume that was similar to the first volume. And after some extended discussions, we kind of agreed on a different focus, and that focus was on how the marine fur trade influenced what was learned about sea otter, the role of sea otters in their ecosystems, as well as their natural history. So Sea Otter Conservation II consists of two sections. There's 6 chapters in the first section that are mainly involved with an introduction, and 5 chapters on the ecological role of sea otters in the communities, and a second section on their biology and the behavior. And I'm going to speak today to chapters 1, 4, 5, and 9 in brief of each of those. So we asked each of the contributing authors to consider the following 3 questions in the crafting of their individual chapters. And the first one was, how did the abundant resources of food and space that were available to recolonizing sea otters, how did that drive sea otter recovery, recolonization, and our ability to detect the ecosystem effects and biological responses that were driven by sea otters? We asked, what were the future ecological effects and biological responses that we might see as recovery continues? And how will sea otters respond as recovery becomes complete and carrying capacity is achieved or exceeded? So I'm going to start with a brief overview of the maritime fur trade and considered as an unintentional experiment. Over the course of 150 years, beginning about 1750, perhaps 1 million sea otters were harvested for their fur throughout their range. When the harvest ended, 13 very small populations remained, all but one along their northern range. Throughout this volume, we consider the fur trade as an unintentional experiment, one that offered unique opportunities for study that was a result of the removal and subsequent recovery of sea otters. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the experimental situation. Now, perhaps not an experiment in the traditional sense of rigorous design, repeatability, random assignments, and replications, but rather one without intent, but with treatments and controls of immense scales of space, including the entire North Pacific shoreline, and time, now approaching 3 centuries, an experiment that's unlikely to ever be repeated. So the maritime fur trade experiment, in this case, the sea otter, can be considered the treatment, first removed by the fur trade and then reintroduced, and the ecosystems as the response to that removal and then to their addition. The study sites can be observed before, during, and after the sea otter's presence and compared, and the sea otters themselves can be sampled over time as they recolonize, and they can be compared among those sites. And there's nearly endless opportunities for study. So this is the foundation of the experiment. The gray shading represents the historic range of sea otters from the islands of northern Japan across the Pacific to the central Baja California Peninsula. I need to note that this shading does not reflect the scale or the distribution of sea otters. If this shading were restricted to the band of habitat that sea otters occupy, it probably wouldn't be able to be seen at this scale. The red circles represent the 11 remnant colonies that persisted, and these symbols are also not to scale because the numbers were so small, they probably wouldn't be observable either. Um, and I'll note that those remnant populations occurred along highly exposed shorelines of remote islands. And the reason that they probably persisted was because of the difficulty that hunters would have had to those islands. So this is a plot of the annual harvest, annual reported harvest over the period of this maritime fur trade. There's nothing much of great interest in this distribution, except for perhaps this area down around 1850 when the Russians had decided that their harvest was exceeding sustainability and they curtailed the harvest to a great extent. But shortly after that, for the last half of the 19th century, the harvest increased. But what was interesting about this plot is that it represents less than a 2% annual harvest, which, based on the kind of the biology of sea otters, should have been sustainable. In fact, a harvest rate of the 1.5% that we saw should have not been reflected in any declines. So this is kind of the first lesson that we can glean from the harvest was that these populations that were being harvested were structured both demographically and possibly behavioral. And that's going to be a kind of a focus of the next few slides that kind of represent this structuring of these populations. And I'm going to do this by an example that comes from Western Prince William Sound, one of the remnant populations. What we're going to do is we're going to look at growth rates over a 20-year period from about 1990 through the early 2000s. And at this scale of Western Prince William Sound, about 5,000 square kilometers, there were 9,000 sea otters, and the population had been stable for that period of time. Now, when we look at a scale of about half of that, about 2,500 square kilometers, we see a population size of about 3,000 animals and an annual increase of about 4.5% a year. We look at a scale now of about a little less than 200 square kilometers, 100 sea otters residing here, but the population was increasing at a rate of 25% per year. And less than about 50 kilometers away, we have a smaller population, if you will, that is 600 animals, and it occupies less than 100 square kilometers, and it too was stable over the same time period. So this comparison of these annual growth rates strongly suggests that these populations were segregated and that they were structured demographically by different birth and survival rates. Now, it's also possible that movements between these areas could have contributed. They would have had to have been highly synchronized movements to account for this disparity of growth rates in the population. But another way to think about structuring of populations is to look at their home range sizes. So here we have a sample of 26 adult sea otters that were instrumented with radio transmitters in 2002. And the dark blue dots represent females aged from 2 to 13 years old, and the blue are male sea otters ranging from 3 to 12 years old. So essentially what you can see here is that these animals have relatively small home ranges, averaging a little less than 20 square kilometers. There's a couple of animals on the upper level that are out there in that 75 to 100 square kilometers. And there's also animals, particularly the territorial males that had territories or annual home range sizes of less than a few square kilometers, which is about a couple of square city blocks. So this was some of the best evidence, and this is consistent with home range estimates from throughout the sea otters range where they're available, that these animals have very small home ranges, resulting in population structure at very small scales. And this was largely what ended up being responsible for the serial depletion of sea otters throughout their range. But since the first fur trade ended in 1911, here's a plot of the recovery of these remnant sea otter populations that grew rather rapidly up until about the end of the 20th century, when we began to see a decline. And there was a loss of 80,000 sea otters, mostly from the Aleutian archipelagos. If that loss hadn't occurred, we'd be well up over 150,000 animals in these remnant populations. But again, this is further evidence of the structuring of these populations. And the declines were actually offset by further increases elsewhere. So the first sea otter translocation, and I use that term translocation here because here the Russians were attempting to move sea otters outside of their historic range. They captured 9 sea otters on the Commander Islands, and they wanted to move those to the Murman coast in the Bering Sea. It was let's see, yeah, nine sea otters. Here's a map, if you will. The first leg was 3,000 miles by ship. And during that, 7 of the 9 animals died, and only 2, and they were both males, were then moved to the Murman coast, where they were released and held in captivity. One of them eventually escaped a couple of years later, but stayed in that same general vicinity. And the one in captivity was euthanized as World War II began. So this was a translocation. It failed, but it was the first. So it's warranted some mention here. The next 5 sea otter reintroductions took place from 1951 to 1959. 86 sea otters were captured from Amchitka Island. Most of those 81 were moved to the Pribilofs, and 5 were moved to Attu. And it's unlikely that any of these translocations persisted, or reintroductions at this time, since they're going back into their historic range. And nearly 70% of the animals that were held for transport died before release, and this demonstrated the need for recognition of the basic sea otter biology and husbandry practices that would be needed for the future successful translocations. And these first successful translocations or reintroductions took place from 1965 to 1972, when 700 plus sea otters were reintroduced to 12 sites, including the Pribilof Islands, Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon. So here's a plot of the translocated animals compared to the remnant populations, indicating the rate of increase and the total success. At this time, there's probably close to 150,000 sea otters in the North Pacific, and the translocated animals or reintroduced animals represent about 1/3 of those. So this is the spatial foundation for this marine fur trade experiment. The brown shaded areas represent the present or current sea otter range. The circles represent the source populations for the reintroductions. The diamonds, the green diamonds represent those remnant populations, and the red diamonds represent those reintroduced populations from Southeast Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, and California. And it's this organization of recovering sea otter populations and the unoccupied habitat that's unshaded over time that allows for these important experimental design features. So I'm going to move on to chapter 4 here, which is the role of sea otters in mixed sediment habitats. And this is in section 1. It presents what we know about the basic ecology of sea otters and their environment. These are some of the most prevalent, yet least understood habitats of sea otters. And that's in part because no remnant populations persisted in these habitats. And also there's a general misconception that it's the canopy forming kelp forests that are the preferred and essential habitats of sea otters. And I think their presence in these mixed habitat sediments certainly reflects a different viewpoint. And their presence here, maybe in part because they've only in recent decades recolonized many of these areas. And it's also a bit more difficult habitat for conducting research and observing these animals. And they can occur in these habitats far from shore, which is where most observations take place. So this is some of the examples of the range of sediment sizes that we are thinking about in terms of mixed sediment habitats, ranging from plot A or the figure A on the top left, where it's primarily silt and muds, and those are obviously siphon holes from clams that you're seeing, to figure B, which represents kind of the sandy shorelines, C, more cobble and gravel, and D going from the cobble and gravel up to the boulder-sized sediments. And it's some of these types of sediments that can actually support some of those algae populations. And in this work, I didn't mention Ben Weitzman and Aaron Foster as the authors of this chapter. I apologize to them. They limited this chapter to sheltered soft sediment habitats or mixed sediment habitats, as opposed to the exposed shorelines, which still remain largely unexplored in terms of the role of sea otters in these habitats. Thus, the importance of mixed sediment habitats to sea otters is largely unrecognized. But in this chapter, they go a long way towards changing that and becoming recognized, primarily in this context of the amount of sea otter habitat out there that is actually mixed sediment, ranging from about 50 to 75%. Some of the highest densities that we observe now occur in these mixed sediment habitats, up to and greater than 20 animals per square kilometer. Some of the highest growth rates that we find in the sea otter populations have been in mixed sediment habitats, including rates that exceed 40% per year in Glacier Bay, far beyond their reproductive potential, and incorporating some immigration. And clams are a mainstay of the sea otter's diet throughout their North Pacific range. And Ben and Aaron did a remarkable job in this chapter by compiling exclusively all of the dietary studies that have been on sea otters, and I think there was about 100 of those that they incorporated in their chapter, where they found this 44% number. It was calculated from a review of all of that foraging and dietary data. So here's what the diet looks like in Glacier Bay. It's a recently recolonized mixed sediment habitat in southeast Alaska, and this is averaged over the course of 18 years. The circle on the left represents the overall diet of sea otters in Glacier Bay. And it's pretty typical of what we see throughout their range, where clams, crabs, mussels, and urchins typically comprise more than 90% of their diet. The larger circle on the right reflects the species of clams that are being consumed in Glacier Bay. And undoubtedly, some of these unidentified clams will be different species of that. This represents 8 species of identified. There's probably several more that were unidentified. So we're going to look at a couple of slides now that actually kind of use that experimental design, if you will, in the most rigorous way possible, in that we established con control sites in Glacier Bay. In about 1990, we began, and let's see, I think there was 20 some sites that were established throughout the bay. And with the anticipation that sea otters would be recolonizing Glacier Bay, and that we would have, at some point, we would have sites that would be untreated by the sea otter's presence, and we would have sites that were treated. And in this case, you're looking at 4 sites that were sampled prior to the sea otters, and sea otters never occupied those. And what we see is that blue mouse and geeky had declines, significant declines in clams. At Sealers, there was no change, and at Wachusett, clams actually increased in abundance. And this is over the course of 10 years. And the next slide, we're going to look at the treatment sites. So there were more treatment sites. In other words, there were more sites where sea otters occupied than when they didn't. And the red bars represent the before clam densities, and the yellow, the after sea otter clam densities. And 2 things to take away from these comparison of these 2 slides. One of them is that the density of clams was quite a bit higher in the sites that sea otters reoccupied, and that sea otters did seem to have an effect at some of the sites. You can see Fingers and Johnson and Secret all significantly declined in the abundance of clams after sea otters. But there were other sites, Berg, Leland, and Puffin, where there did not appear to be a significant effect of sea otters on the abundance of clams. I should note that these 2 slides, they are not included in the chapter. I brought these in because they were part of the work that Ben had done in Glacier Bay. And they demonstrated that before-after control impact study design. One of the studies, field studies that they do present in this chapter is the change in the density of a large subtidal muscle, the modiolus muscle, the horse muscle. The plot on the left, number A or letter A, demonstrates the change in the density of the horse muscles in shallow waters in Glacier Bay, with densities approaching or exceeding 200, averaging 100 per square meter early or prior to sea otters recolonization, and essentially moving down to near 0 after sea otters occupied the bay. And the image on the right is a picture of a modiolus bed. And these are large animals. These are animals that are kind of on the range of 6 to 8 to 10 inches in length, and several ounces each. And they can occur well beyond the diving depth range of sea otters. And this would be an example of a bed that's deep enough that it would have a refuge from sea otter predation. And we see those in Glacier Bay with kind of remote sensing cameras. Now, here's an image of sea otters, a sea otter in Morro Bay, California, who had just excavated a geoduck clam, which can occur down to about 1 meter in depth, which requires fairly extensive excavations to extract. And it's possible that geoducks have a refuge from sea otter predation by depth, but clearly that refuge is not complete. So there's other effects of sea otters in mixed sediment communities, in addition to their role of predation on the infauna, and that would include mechanisms of disturbance. In image A, you see plumes from an aerial photograph of, I think there's actually 6 sea otters in here that are foraging, with each of these plumes representing one of those foraging sea otters. So the next image over is B. The foraging of sea otters in these mixed sediment habitats can result in accumulation of shell litter, which is shown to be a substrate for other organisms to attach to. And the bottom 2 images represent foraging pits created by sea otters, a major disturbance in these types of habitats created by sea otters. So there's just a few images to illustrate those high densities of sea otters in these mixed sediment habitats. Let's see, the upper right is on an island in Alaska. The lower left is in Glacier Bay. So in summary, chapter 4, the importance of mixed sediment habitats are largely underappreciated, with unique challenges that include recent occupation and infaunal populations that's difficult to sample, and a habitat type that is not restricted to depths, so they can be difficult to sample. Sea otters are capable of reducing the density and sizes of clams they prey on, but the ecological effects of sea otters in the mixed sediment habitats are less clear, particularly over the long term. And the complex relations between sea otters and humans provide grounds for new research engaging the experimental opportunities. Okay, so the next chapter we're going to talk about is chapter 9 by Julie Yee and 14 additional co-authors whose names I'm not going to mention. They're on the screen now. But this was a multidisciplinary study looking at the terrestrial, oceanic, and nearshore factors that influence the growth and recovery of sea otter populations. In this chapter, the authors focus on food and health factors. And here you will see that the authors take full advantage of the opportunities resulting from the maritime fur trade. Okay, so here's essentially the geography, the spatial orientation of the decline of the use of the maritime fur trade. Each of these ovals represent study sites, and I'll talk about what was done at each of these sites. The red site, Alaska Peninsula, represents a site that fell outside of the constraints placed on the site selection, in that it was a population that was in decline, and we knew that the reason for that decline was predation. In each of the other blocks, you'll see dark green symbols, and those represent core populations that have been present in their habitats for more than 20 years. Sometimes they had been present for many, many decades. Associated with each of these populations are nearby populations that are called peripheral populations, denoted by the letter P. And those are populations that had been present for usually less than a decade. They were still in a growth phase of their population, and it was presumed that space and food would not be limiting in those populations. And so they were paired fairly closely in Southeast Alaska, Vancouver Island, Washington, and California. Although at Katmai and Western Prince William Sound did not have an associated peripheral group. The nearest associated peripheral group was at Katmai. So these constitute the 6 locations and the 12 populations, if you will, that were sampled in this project. And the approach here was to compare and contrast the health, diet, and population growth rates between these sites with varying lengths of occupancy. And just briefly, the field methods. At each site, we collected approximately 50 forage bouts, which represents about upwards of between 500 and 1,000 forage dives that we could characterize their diet. And the population surveys we could also add to, but each of these sites was selected because there were population level data that allowed us to calculate population growth rates. At each of these sites, we captured sea otters. A total of 343 animals were captured, and they were brought ashore or brought on board the research vessel for physical health examinations, as well as the collection of tissues for further health analyses. So the data collection I mentioned, the surveys were collected. Survey data were collected between 1981. They were used between 1981 and 2013, even if there were prior data. This was to allow us to calculate comparatively recent and comparative population estimates among these 12 sites. The individual capture and health sampling included 10 clinical metrics, including serum chemistry and hematology, 2 body condition metrics, looking at the size of the animals, hormones, and 13 genes were used to evaluate the health of each individual. The foraging observations consisted of the diet and dive times and surface times and a number of different metrics that would be used to calculate energy intake rates and thereafter the time each individual spent foraging. So these 3 plots represent the basic findings of the dietary and energetic work. So in the first pair of bars, all of the bars, the dark green represent the core populations and the light green, the peripheral populations. And the first pair represents the energy intake rates that were calculated from the foraging. And from this, we see that the average intake rate in the core populations was 8.2 kilocalories per minute and 15.7 in the peripheral populations. And when we use those values to calculate how many hours a day an animal would be required to feed in order to gain those calories, we see that the core population animals had to feed 8.5 hours a day, and the peripheral populations about half of that, or 4.6 hours per day. And this difference in these foraging hours per day corresponded with population growth rates that were reduced in the populations that spent more time feeding, and the population growth rates were 3 times higher where food was not a limiting factor and where animals weren't required to feed more than about 4.6 hours per day. So that was the kind of the averages. We're going to look at here the plot of the absolute values that came from each of the populations. You'll see that there's 11 here because the Alaska Peninsula site had a different pattern. But what we see is that the hours per day feeding on the y-axis was highest when the energy intake rates were lowest and declined down to values that were just about 3 hours per day when they were getting energy intake rates that were above 20 kilocalories per minute. This was really a great fit, as the line demonstrates. This plot looks at the relationship for again, for those individual populations, not the means that is found between food availability and the population growth rate. So energy intake rate is now on the y-axis, and population growth rates were lowest for when the energy intake rates were lowest, and population growth increased to its maximum value as energy intake rates increased. I should also say, before I summarize, that there were some differences in the health metrics between populations, but they were relatively minor. One of them was that the male sea otters in the peripheral populations tended to have poorer dental conditions, and the females tended to have poorer dental conditions in the core populations. And we're just not quite sure how to interpret that. But in summary of this project, the complex spatial structure of the remnant and reintroduced sea otter populations enabled a robust sampling design. The availability of food was an important density-dependent factor driving sea otter population growth across more than 3,000 kilometers. And where sea otter densities were low in the Alaska Peninsula due to predation, the diet and energy were not a limiting factor. And density independent factors, that would being predation, can also be important, but they leave a different signature with high energy consumption and low growth rates, and in fact, negative growth rates in this case. Okay. So I'm going to take the opportunity here to synthesize the biology and behavior work that's been gained on sea otters from the marine fur trade experiment. And so in general, during the early phases of recovery, and this is when food and space are abundant resources, we see early female production as early as age 2. We see high reproductive rates across all ages of females. We see low mortality and high densities of animals with high population growth. We see large group sizes. We see less territoriality, less segregation by the sexes, and larger home ranges of the individuals. Late in recovery, as food and space become limiting and the populations are approaching or achieving equilibrium densities, we see that the females reproduce at a later time. They may not reproduce until age 3 or 4, but we still see high reproductive rates. Population growth rates are low, and that's a consequence of high mortality, particularly in the young animals and in the very old. We see reduced densities, we see smaller group sizes, we see more territoriality, and we see greater segregation by sex and smaller home ranges. Now, in combination, the contrast between these two columns leads me to consider the potential that the social behavior and organization of the sea otter populations can contribute to population stability at equilibrium densities, or as food and space become restricted. Okay, so the last chapter I'm going to talk about is chapter 5. And I found this to be kind of one of the more novel looks at the role of sea otters in the ecosystem. And this work was authored by Heather Coletti and her co-authors, and titled Sea Otter Mediated Linkages Among Oceanic, Nearshore, and Terrestrial Systems. So we need to think a little bit about the relationship between the oceans and the nearshore and the watershed, and the potential, if you will, of the exchange of nutrients, matter, or other components in between these systems. Now, it's pretty clear to see that watersheds are draining fresh water into the oceans. And it's pretty clear to see that the oceans are distinct from the nearshore in terms of the role of phytoplankton in that system as composed to the role of the algae in the nearshore system. And in this chapter, the authors describe the role of the sea otters in contributing to the process of nutrient transport across these ecosystems in detail. And they're using data from the marine fur trade experience along the Katmai coast of Alaska. And I'm not going to speak to kind of the data that they include in this, but rather show you some images of the potential ways that these nutrients and matter can be exchanged between these ecosystems and the role that sea otters can play in it. And here we see simply a huge amount of biomass in this form of kelps that are routinely distributed along shorelines where they serve as an independent or unique community within themselves, and they're also moving carbon into the terrestrial system as they decompose on the shore. And also from the near shore to the land, there are a number of consumers in the terrestrial system that come down and forage in the nearshore system. In this case, a brown bear feeding on clams. It will eventually move some of that matter up into the terrestrial system. An image representing the movement of biomass from the ocean to the terrestrial system in the form of a dead whale carcass that is beach cast and provides great parcels of energy into the nearshore, taken through brown bears as well as other consumers. And in this case, in this image, a gray wolf having predated a sea otter is now taking that biomass, moving it from the nearshore marine into the terrestrial system. So the author spent a great deal of time and effort developing the chapter and in detail describing these processes. And as a result, or as a matter of kind of translating the technical nature of the chapter, they engaged an artist to prepare this drawing that represents the movement of marine derived nutrients from the nearshore and the ocean into the terrestrial system. And along with this, the author, Sarah Gilman, wrote some words, essentially a poem that translates the chapter in a succinct way, I felt. So I'm going to read to you the words that she wrote that were her interpretation of what the chapter contained. What makes the land rich? Once it was the sea. Before dams, salmon swam inland by the billions, and their bodies became trees, became other animals, became people. Before men on ships slaughtered whales for their oil and baleen, whale bodies washed ashore in greater number. The flesh they had built through long lives and migrations at sea helped polar bears survive past the end of the ice age. They brought wolves to the beach and darkened the sky with condors and other winged scavengers. Before the fur trade, sea otters made underwater kelp forests along the coasts with their appetites. These forests sheltered fish, crustaceans, and mollusks that fed other fish, seabirds, seals, and the sea otters. When these animals died and beached, their carcasses fed others still. What makes the land rich? It can be the sea again. As some dams come down, as some whale species slowly rebound, as sea otters recover and spread along the margins of the North Pacific, devouring urchins that made the undersea forests into deserts. Kelps follow, beckoning their creatures back, and with looping fronds and blades in shafts of sun. And after storms, kelps and carcasses again accumulate in wave-thrown mounds along the beach. Wolves arrive and scatter picked bones among cobble and grass. Bears gorge on muscle and fat to heat them through long winters of rest. Eagles and fox tear at what remains. And so the ocean travels on fins and flippers, on wings, on webbed and clawed feet. It leaves tracks, it leaves eggs, excrement, and bodies made of its bounty. It makes itself into earth and grows. So now I'm going to summarize this with some lessons learned from the unintentional fur trade. Protections were sufficient, particularly in the northern portions of the range, to avoid extinction. But range expansion is slow and variable, reflecting restricted movements. Reintroductions were of significant benefit in terms of increasing numbers and range, but high initial declines reflected high fidelity to their prior home ranges. The contrasts of ecosystems with and without sea otters identified the important ecological role of sea otters. It now extends beyond the rocky reefs to ecosystem linkages. The not so obvious lessons. The high growth rates that we see in recovering sea otter populations are an artifact of the fur trade and the abundant resources of food and space that resulted from their absence. Home ranges from 1 to perhaps 20 square kilometers or a few tens of kilometers of shoreline dictate demographic structuring on the order of hundreds of individuals rather than thousands. Kelp forests have long been considered preferred habitat, but now sea otters are found in their highest densities within mixed sediment habitats. Only recently has the return of sea otters illuminated their role in transporting marine-derived nutrients from the nearshore into the terrestrial ecosystems, where the kelps and animals, including the sea otter themselves, are regularly deposited on shores and moved inland via predation and scavenging. The future of the maritime fur trade experiment continues. Opportunities for new and ongoing ecological studies and biological understandings will continue with the transition to full reoccupation of nearshore habitats by sea otters. New factors that mediate sea otter densities, perhaps things like variation in their invertebrate prey, reproduction, and the role of social structure and behavior may emerge. And the restoration of nearshore ecosystems provides compelling justification for new sea otter reintroductions. And I'm going to close with thanking you for your attention.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jim. That was a lot of wonderful information, and we've got several questions. We have about 6 minutes to answer them.
Okay.
So I'll go through as quick as I can. Christine asks, has there been an increase in leptospiriosis in areas where the sea otters create the foraging pools?
So you're referring to Chapter 9. Disease was, and the answer to the question was no. We did not see throughout the 12 populations that we sampled a difference in diseases between the core and the periphery.
Excellent. Okay, Eric asks, has there been any diet studies on sea otters off of the Washington coast? I'm curious if their diet and foraging behavior is similar or different to the populations in Glacier Bay. I'm thinking the sea otters off Washington might have a similar diet and behaviors to potential reintroduced populations in Oregon and Northern California.
Let's see. So there are ongoing historical and ongoing studies by the Seattle Aquarium and Sean Larson, who's going to speak a bit later, um, dietary studies of sea otters in Washington. And um, the how that relates to yes, so in Washington, in those peripheral areas where they are more recently recolonized and where food and space are abundant, I believe that the highest energy intake rate that we saw on those plots came from the peripheral populations in Washington. Um, Glacier Bay wasn't one of those sites, but there were sites in Southeast Alaska and Whale Bay that also had high energy recovery rates. Is that, and I hope that answered the question.
I hope so too.
Okay.
This is Sean. I can
Oh,
chime in really quick.
for it.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So, sea otters in Washington have both rocky kelp forest ecosystems as well as mixed sediment sandy areas. And in the south area of Washington, in the sandy areas, they're mostly eating clams, primarily razor clams, and those do have high energy components. And then in the areas where they're more in the rocky kelp forest ecosystems, they're mostly eating crabs and clams as well. But in general, Washington has a high energy intake. I hope that answers it.
Thanks, Sean. All right, we have one last question here. Has there ever been a mixing of the northern and southern sea otters, or are their ranges separated sufficiently?
Mm. Again, Sean could probably help answer that, but I'll take a stab. I will say that there has been historically, prior to the fur trade, there was exchange between northern and southern sea otters. Has there been any change since the fur trade? Um, that's less clear. There's not any good evidence that there has been.
Okay. Do we have any more lingering questions? Yes. All right. Megan says, hello, I was surprised to hear that the percentage of sea otters harvested was only 1 to 2%. This is lower than I had expected. How do you come to this conclusion? I know with the beaver fur trade was initially grossly underestimated in California. Could this be the case with sea otters?
There is a possibility, probably a fair likelihood that the total harvest was underrepresented. In other words, um, not every ship may have fully represented every animal that was harvested. Um, so that could contribute to a higher rate. It's unlikely that that higher rate would have exceeded, 2 or 3 or 4%. So more likely is that the harvest was conducted systematically across the North Pacific. And because there's not a great deal of movement amongst populations or geographic areas, the harvest, even though it was at a low rate, it was it was allocated in a non-general way. So if sea otters were uniformly distributed across the Pacific Ocean, we never would have seen a decline. But because the annual harvest was allocated in very small areas, they were able to extirpate one place, move on to the next, and then move on to the next. It was a serial depletion rather than a uniform distribution of the harvest. Does that should make sense?
Yes, and that's perfectly on the dot at 10 a.m. We made it. So thank you so much, Jim, for your amazing